Welcome to Syntax. We've got a good one for you today. Let's talk about Sentry real quick. This podcast is brought to you by Sentry. Sentry does error exception, performance insights. Check it out, sentry.io/syntax. We have been trying to get today's guest on for a long time, and you folks have been requesting her for a long time. So we're very excited to have Jen Simmons on. She is a web technologies evangelist at Apple. She is responsible for a large part of CSS Grid, a lot of the layout stuff in the browser, lots of CSS, and we can go on about what she works on. But today she's here to talk to us about some really neat stuff in CSS web standards in general, as well as like Safari has been killing it lately. And we're here to ask her why that is and how they're able to move so fast and all that good stuff. So welcome, Jen. Thanks so much for coming on.
Hello. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You want to give us a quick rundown of who you are, what you do, and a little bit of your history? I know I gave a quick rundown, but I think it would be worth explaining to anyone who maybe hasn't heard of you what your past has been like.
Sure. Yeah. So personally, I worked in theater and the arts for years. Then I was a front-end developer, web designer and developer for many years. And then I got into, because I love teaching, I've always loved teaching and empowering people, got into developer advocacy, developer relations, working on browsers, working on web standards, especially CSS for me. And yeah, so I worked at Firefox for a number of years, and now I've been at Apple working on Safari for a number of years, which is a really great place to be. I love it even way more than I thought I would. So it's quite an honor and a privilege to work with such a smart team, of people who really are. I mean, I know folks don't necessarily believe it, but what I discovered when I got to Apple is that people really do understand the web. They care about the web very deeply and have been doing incredible work for years that a lot of people don't even necessarily attribute to Apple, because they're not, we don't usually wander around saying, hi, this is who I am, this is where I'm from, please, me, like, listen to me and how awesome I am. There's a certain level of humility there that means, I think, a lot of the innovation and a lot of the impact that the team behind Safari has gone a bit unnoticed. But that doesn't mean that impact wasn't there. It's every day I'm like learning, like, wait a minute, we did that? I didn't realize I didn't know that Safari was the first browser with a private browsing mode. I didn't realize that Safari folks on our team were the folks who wrote the HTML5 design principles. Like, I didn't realize. It's cool.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of people from a lot of different companies who are all collaborating together to make the web what it is.
Let's talk about that. So that's my big question. I've noticed Safari has been absolutely killing it lately. I've been reading every couple of weeks, there's a new either technical preview of Safari or a new major version of Safari that comes out. And the blog posts are, sometimes I'm unable to scroll to the bottom of what it is. And here on the podcast, we go through and talk about a lot of the new improvements to CSS. And a lot of times it says this is only implemented in Safari. Safari is the first one to implement this. Safari has been first to a lot of this stuff. So, and I've gotten some heat for that on Twitter because people say like, oh, but this Flexbox bug from 3 years ago that is no longer an issue is whatever. And it's like, yes, that happened. But I feel like there's been crazy momentum lately. And we're here to ask you why? What's going on at Apple that Safari is doing so well? Is it you? A lot of people said it's you.
It's a combination of things. It's a combination of lots of small changes that are adding up to a lot, right? So I mean, that's how life usually is, right? There's no one thing. So part of it is communication. Yeah. We have been on the evangelism team working really hard to make sure that every time there's a release of Safari, that there's really great release notes for that release, and that we not only list all of the features, but we also list all of the bug fixes, at least things that are relevant to web developers, right? There's other bugs that get fixed, but so if you are stumbling over that one bug that's been bothering you for the last 3 years, that you could see that, oh, look, they fixed it. That fantastic. In fact, I added up some totals for 2023. There were 818 bug fixes that we put in release notes over the year, and 270 new features in 2023.
It's wild that it feels like you all don't get enough credit for that, because one thing that I think developers overall like is release notes. I see that all the time where people are complaining about, an app update in the app description release notes are just bug fixes and improvements, and people complain about, hey, there's no transparency here. Why isn't anybody? But here, you all are releasing these giant release notes, and nobody is really giving the credit due for that.
Yeah. I mean, so there's several places that people can look. So one of them is the release notes are on developer.apple.com. They come out when the first beta goes out. So for instance, right now we're in the middle of January 16th is today. The beta, Safari 17.3 is in beta. So that is, if you want to know what's coming in the next version of Safari, you can go look at the beta release notes. And those beta release notes will get updated as the beta gets updated. Sometimes, something is not quite ready. Like we put full screen API in Safari 17.2 for iOS. But then while it was in beta, this is the whole purpose of a beta, folks were testing it and giving us feedback. And we were like, looks like it needs a little more polish. So it didn't ship in Safari 17.2 because it needed a little bit more time. And so the beta release notes can be really helpful if you want to see what's coming and you want to help us by testing and letting us know so we can make sure that we get things right before we ship them. And then when the release comes out for that version of Safari, it is also, the release notes are updated on developer.apple.com, but also we write a giant article on webkit.org that is not just a list, because release notes are a very terse list, just a very clear, like, let's just list everything, where the articles that come out are, hey, we're going to, at the bottom, we'll list all the fixes, but at the top and in the middle, we go through all the features and we say, hey, this feature is shipping, but what is that feature? What is that good for? Here's 2 sentences about it. Here's a little demo. Here's an example. Here are some ideas about how you might use it, so that we can quickly teach designers, developers a little bit about each thing. Not enough to be able to use it, but enough to know what it is. File it back in the back of your mind to be like, oh, that's right, that thing came out. I didn't need it. I didn't have time to learn about it, but now my team needs it. So now I'm going to go track it down. I'll go look it up on a tutorial or something and learn more about it. So we're hoping that those big articles can be really useful to introduce people to so many of these new features that are hitting browsers these days. And to be able to get kind of a quick, because you're right, it's long, but also it goes through things very quickly. So
you can scan it pretty quickly and see if there's anything that like applies to you. And I love that because it's somebody who makes a podcast about new stuff to web development. It's really nice to be able to quickly scan it and see a huge list of it.
Well, and that's super important to us, is that the people who make podcasts, who make YouTube videos, who make tutorials, who are writing blog posts, who are speaking at conferences, who are working on the data can I use on an MDN browser compatibility data, right? So like that anybody who's going to be teaching other people about all this stuff has accurate information, because that's part of, what changed? So one thing is that the release notes and these big articles are more comprehensive than they used to be. They used to sort of hit the highlights, and now the effort is to try to hit everything. And then one of the ways in which people, you're sitting there, you're making a website, you're writing code, you're like, I wonder if this thing I want to use is supported in all the browsers. So you go to canIuse.com and you look, and it says, no, it's not supported in this browser. And you're like, oh, that's too bad. I'm angry. It's not supported. I guess that's true. And what we were finding is that sometimes that wasn't actually true. People were really upset with Safari for not having support for something, and they would ping me on social media, which I love. Please do ping me on social media. And I would look it up. I'd be like, oh, we don't have support for that. And I'd ask around. I'd look it up myself. I'd go find out. And they'd be like, Oh, actually, we do have support, but the data that's being used to display support isn't accurate. It's out of date.
Interesting.
So we put a lot of and the teams behind it are great teams. Like, it's just, there's a lot to keep track of, keep track of. So it's very easy for something to slip through the cracks. And so we've helped try to go through everything and just find, I spend as much time on the sites as I can to be like, let me just find anything. Are there any things that are wrong? Let me fix those.
What about some of the conspiracies around that? And this is my own conspiracy as to why the Safari has been so accelerated lately. Is there something at Apple that is going to be leaning more heavily on HTML, CSS, JavaScript? Is there something why all of these APIs have all of a sudden been popping up?
Yeah, there's all kinds of theories that I've heard. There's many flavors of theories. And I really mean this honestly, as a human being who's always prided myself on being very straightforward and very honest with people. Like, I have seen no evidence of those theories being true. Okay. I really haven't. What I've seen is a busy team dedicated to doing the right thing for the web. And sometimes what I've seen is that someone will be upset that a specific API hasn't been supported, and then they're trying to understand why, and then they start to come up with a theory. But often there is a reason why, and the reason is not at all whatever theory they've tried to come up with. It's that the team at WebKit Safari are working really hard to protect things that are important to Apple. So what are those things? Privacy, user experience, accessibility, security, having APIs that are well designed, that developers are going to be happy with over the long term, that weren't rushed out the door, sort of over-engineered, or it feels like it's going to cover all the use cases, but it really doesn't, or it's perfect for these situations, but it's kind of not a good API for these other situations, right? So sometimes we've been like, no, let's really take the time in the standards organizations for web standards and make a really great API. And sometimes, patience, sometimes a web standard can take 2 or 3 years, and folks don't want it to take 2 or 3 years. They want it to get done in 6 months or something. And so then they have these theories about why, and it's like, it's not that complicated. But so anyone listening could go to webkit.org, and there's many things here, including those big long articles I was talking about. Also release notes for Safari Technology Preview, which can be super interesting. But if you look up in the menu under feature status, there's a page called Standards Positions. And if you're interested, like, why is such and such not shipping? You can look it up. So one of them if I look at this list right now, it says file system access. And you can see that we have publicly stated that we oppose this API and for security reasons. And there's a little number on the left. And if you click on the number, you can go see the discussion on a GitHub issue. So these are stated publicly. It's not very common. It's very, it's a little rare when we actually oppose a standard. But it's all here. So sometimes people, I think they get upset about us opposing one standard, and then they just sort of extrapolate that into a complicated theory that's not at all based in reality. Yeah. When, we take pride on what is it that our customers are going to experience when they use Safari on Apple devices. Like, that matters a lot to us. So if a particular idea that would be really cool, that would make websites really amazing, is going to just churn through people's batteries, then we're not going to rush that out the door. We're going to be like,
yeah,
we aren't so sure about that. Let's, and maybe we'll figure it out. There's a lot of things like we shipped push notifications, right? Web push, first on Mac and then later on iOS for web apps. And folks wanted that to happen sooner. One thing that we really wanted to make sure we got right, and we implemented when we figured it out, when we knew we had it right, was what is the experience for people who are using their device and getting prompted over and over again to allow notifications, right? I mean, Safari was the first browser to ever put notifications in a browser with something called Safari push notifications that were in Mac. many, many years ago, before the web standards existed, we had built this thing called Safari push notifications. And we learned from that. We learned that, there are a lot of websites. You go to social media, you click a link, you land on the website. The very first thing you see is a request for permission to send notifications.
Oh, no one likes that. It's true. And
right.
Everyone blocks them all.
I just got a message from my dad last week.
Yeah.
I have a virus on my Mac. What do I do? I'm like, what is the virus? He says, well, this pop-up keeps popping up. I'm like, well, what is this? And sure enough, it was a notification from a website. He was trying to stream a football game that was out of network or whatever. He goes onto some site. It asks him for a notification. Next thing you know, he's got notifications popping up from some janky website, right? That is trying to do that. So I totally get that. And it's weird how, like, I don't know, the idea of wanting to get things right can be so misconstrued into ulterior motives, or people are just looking for reasons to be negative about something like this, instead of thinking, oh, what is the most likely reason why they haven't shipped this? Oh, it's not fully baked.
Autoplay video was the same as when HTML5 video came out. iOS didn't allow you to either play inline or autoplay. And then Chrome did. And what happened? Friggin' auto playing ads, full blast video. And that was super annoying. And Chrome had to claw it back and say, you cannot autoplay unless it's associated with a click or it's muted. Like sometimes those things do take time to figure out.
Yeah. And so then the other thing that really did help us knock down the list of things that developers wanted and needed the most is, I think it was around the summer of 2021 where there were quite a few blog posts that people wrote, really well thought out, carefully, like thoughtful blog posts about, hey, these features are missing in Safari and it's frustrating. And here are the workarounds that we have to do. Here's the use case that I have that I can't implement correctly. Here's why. Here's what it is I want from the web technology. And this is where Safari's letting me down. And that really makes a big difference. It makes a big difference. People filing bugs at bugs.webkit.org makes a big difference. I know sometimes it can be quiet over there and there might not seem like there's a lot of activity, but all of that information gets pulled into the system that we use to plan our engineering efforts. And there's a lot of noise over there in our system. So like it is happening. It's just maybe not always visible, which is another thing that we're talking about. Like, what can we do to make it more visible? But that level of communication when web developers let us know, especially with use cases and especially with thoughtfulness and especially with creativity, like creatively think about what it is that you're needing and wanting and why. And sometimes we really want to push forward. I mean, like with push notifications, we have all kinds of ideas about how it could actually be better that we're working on right now. So there's often ways in which we might hesitate to implement what exists now, but if we can catch the right idea about where the web really needs it to go, then that could help move things forward as well.
Yeah. So is bugs.webkit.org the best place to notify Apple about things?
Or complaining on Twitter?
Yeah.
Well, Mastodon, I'd recommend, at least if you want to talk to me, I'm on Mastodon far more than I am on X these days. Bugs.webkit.org is the best place to report browser bugs and problems. I mean, there's more than one place though. Like, so if you, and this is true for any browser, if you're on a website and that website seems broken in the browser that you're in, you can go to WebCompat. There's a WebCompat website. I should have the URL memorized. Yeah, webcompat.com. If you are using an Apple device and you feel like there's something going wrong with the operating system or something else that's deeper than just the browser, and you want to create a file and issue that has more information attached so that, like if Safari crashed, well, it's like, why did it crash? There's information that the operating system that can provide about that crash, like, I don't know, was it a graphic thing or was it a memory thing or was it, something else? If you go to feedbackassistant.apple.com and you go through that system, there's a way to attach what's called a sysdiagnose file, which will, if you give it permission, this is only if you give it permission, but if you say, please do attach these files, then it will attach sort of diagnose files to help. And sometimes it can be, depending on the bug, sometimes that can actually be super helpful, because just saying, oh, crash, it's like, well, we don't know. We have no idea why. But if you include that kind of a file for diagnosis, then it helps engineers get deeper into like what actually happened. But, for sometimes when it's like, oh, this CSS isn't working the way that I expected it to, those things you can easily file at bugs.webkit.org. And don't worry about filing a dupe. Like, it's fine. I know that many times open source communities can be very spicy about duplicates and get very grumpy. It's fine. File the 14th. Yeah. It's going to be the 150-second dupe. And it's like, that's fine. Yeah. In fact, in some ways, that's a good signal for us there's a lot of the same bug getting reported.
Let's talk about the CSS color profile. So we had a bit of a call before this episode, and you explained the color spaces, color profiles very clearly, and I thought that was fantastic, as well as like there's many different ways to specify colors, some of which don't make sense at all. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so color, wide gamut color is super exciting, and it felt like 2023 was really a breakthrough year for wide gamut color, in part perhaps because of Interrupt 2023, because it was in Interrupt 2023. But it is complicated. Color is so complicated. If you really start to try to wrap your head around the whole thing, it's too much for me to understand. It's too hard. So, I made a session for WWDC last year, which I do definitely recommend, especially if people are interested in what I'm about to say. I go into more detail in the session, and also there's visuals because it's a video, so you can see a lot of what I'm talking about. But in making that session, I started to really understand color on another level that I hadn't before, in part because I could ask my super smart colleagues at Apple and they could help me out. So I like, when teaching things, to make them as simple as they can be and empower you with all you need to know, but also leave out all the parts you don't need to know. So to me, this is how we should think about it. The color gamut, what changed? So for many years, monitors couldn't represent color at all, or they could only represent a few colors. So we had the WebSafe color palette. And then color monitors became more awesome, and there were many, many more of them, and everybody had color monitors. And you could display sRGB, which is a certain color gamut, which colors in the world can actually be seen on an sRGB monitor. Also, HD television had the same sRGB color gamut. There were many, many things in our world. Cameras all used sRGB. And then people are like, smart people who make monitors and cameras were like, wow, I wonder if we can push the envelope further and we can represent more of what the human eye can actually see, because there are more colors in the world that sRGB can't display. So we ended up with P3. So P3 color is a wider color gamut. P3 is all over the place. It's been on, it's shipped in, we ship support for P3 color in Safari 10.0 with images, and then with CSS in Safari 10.1, which there's been some confusion about. People keep saying we supported it in Safari 15, but it's like, no, actually, we started supporting it in Safari 10.1 many, many years ago. That was around the same time that iPhone, iPad, Mac started supporting. So all of the new screens for many years now have had P3 color. And now even more screens around, in the world that we live in, all the screens we look at during our day, more and more and more of them support P3 color. So in some ways, the web is behind, where web designers are still staying within the sRGB color gamut, and they're only picking colors from inside that gamut. And they're missing an opportunity to pick some really gorgeous, really vibrant colors. So then the question becomes, well, if you're going to define a color in CSS, how do you define it? There are many, many ways to define colors. If you use some of the older ways, named colors, hexadecimal, the RGB function, HLS function, or the HWB function, you are only ever going to be able to define a color that exists inside sRGB. It's literally not possible to define any colors outside of sRGB with those ways of defining a color. So to me, it's like, well, they're gone. They're gone. They're dead to me. Goodbye. I'm never going to use. No, that's not true. I use hexadecimal colors still all the time. But often I try to push myself away from those. And instead, what we can use are the newer functions to define color. So one of them is the color function. That's the very first one that shipped in browsers because the CSS spec was ready for it. The color function, you then say if you want it, basically the color function, you define red, green, and blue between 0 and 100%. But if you want to say, well, when I say 100%, I mean 100% in P3 color, then you need to say color P3. So you put the little, which color gamut are you going to define or your numbers in the little function. You can also use the newer functions, LCH, lab, OK lab, and OK LCH. Those are the things that came out just last year, or actually the year before. Well, both end of 2022 and into 2023, because I mean, Safari had them implemented for years, sitting there in Safari Technology Preview waiting. But the CSS specifications, the web standards weren't done yet. So the working group needed a little bit more time to come to an agreement. So once they did come to an agreement, it became possible to ship those. And those are the things, all of that, P3 color plus the color function plus these 4 new functions all shipped in Gecko for Firefox and in Chromium for Chrome and Edge and Samsung Internet Browser and many other browsers. So support is starting to get really, really good as people update their browsers because all 3 engines have support for these now.
Okay, so it's P3 and sRGB are color gamuts, and how you access those gamuts via the different functions that we have are color spaces. Is that right?
Yeah, well, the word color space is really complicated, and I ended up personally, as a teacher, coming to a place where I was like, I think I'm going to try to avoid using the word space because nobody really understands what the heck we're talking about. So I talk about color gamuts, gamut being like, how many colors can you actually represent? And model being, what is the math?
Okay.
So if there's going to be 3 numbers and you're like 12, 255, 32, like what does that math map to? And there are these models. So like LCH, the L means lightness. You're basically defining from either from 0 to 100% or from like 0 to 255 as a number. Like how dark or light do you want it to be? C is chroma, H is hue. So you're like defining a hue, a chroma, and a brightness. Where lab is like L is lightness, and then there's an A axis, which like at one end is green and the other end is red/magenta. Wow. And then a B axis, which is like at one end is sort of blue/cyan, and at the other end is yellow. Okay. And so you're basically saying, am I more blue or yellow? Am I more green or red?
Oh, wow.
And so lab and OK lab are very similar, that like OK lab is OK LAB, so LAB and LAB, but it's just a different math. Now, there are people in the world who understand the math and who know the difference mathematically, what the differences are in the models between LCH, OK LCH versus and lab versus I'm not one of those people. And I don't think that most web designers or developers need to be those people either. I think the thing to know is there's 4 different color models, and it changes the mathematics. And so I could see somebody, because what I heard a lot happening last year is that people would have these debates where they'd be like, which one is better? I like OKLCH. That's the best one. So I'm only ever going to use that one, as if they were choosing a different set of colors when they were using OKLCH or lab or whatever. And it's like, no, you're not choosing a different set of colors. The set of colors are P3. If you're using if you're defining P3 or if you have a P3 monitor, like it's going to be P3, but the mathematical model. So maybe, I think there are people who understand hexadecimal numbers to be like 3 numbers for R, G, and B in hexadecimal. And they think about like, I don't know, X or like F comes after 9 or whatever. But there are many of us who don't actually break it down that way, and you just write the hexadecimal numbers. You don't really ever think about it. So I'm sure there are people who are going to get really into like memorizing that the C in chroma means this, and if I push the number up this direction, it's going to be this way, and if I pull the number that way, it's going to be this. And so maybe in that way, you'll end up with your favorite model because that's the way you like to think about the math. But the end result for the functions are actually going to be identical if you pick the same color. Like if you're defining a very specific shade of blue, you can define that very specific shaded blue in all 4 models. The numbers are just going to be different because the models are different. Yeah. The time when it actually comes into, I think that the time when it actually matters more, like which model are you going to use, is if you're interpolating a gradient, or you're defining a relative color, or you're mixing colors. Because in that way, you're not just saying, I pick this shade of pink. Yeah. Instead, what you're doing is you're saying, on this end, I have orange, and over here, I got yellow or green, and then I want you to make a gradient in the middle. And so the computer, browser computer, you are going to do all the math in between. I just pick the endpoints. If you choose one model, it's going to use that model to choose the in-betweens. And if you switch the model, it's going to switch the model to do the in-betweens.
Oh, yeah. And often those gradients look much nicer. And sometimes they have like a little bit more green than you're expecting, but often they're really nice. There's less banding. Well, totally. Makes sense that there's less banding because there's literally more colors, right?
Well, I don't know. I'm curious about the less banding. I don't know that I've seen that because you're not going to have more colors. Like it's still all P3 color. You still have how many other colors?
Sorry, I mean using versus an RGB gradient. If you're doing like a really wild gradient in RGB, and you're going from one color to another, and it's quite a difference between those two colors. You start to see banding if it's like the whole website. Whereas if you move that to one of these functions in P3. There's more colors, right? So there should be less banding. Yeah.
There are more colors in P3. And also it makes, like I have an example that I put in this video of a linear gradient. And it's basically going from white, just pure white, to blue, like if you use the named color blue in CSS, the blue from the web. And it's like, and then I have an example of 8 different and this is where I do use the word color space because it's sort of the color models, but actually there's more of them. And there are the old ones too. And you can, so I've got sRGB linear, OKLab, LCH, OKLCH, lab, HSL, and HWB. And the differences are really drastic. So like OKLab and LCH basically look like they go like through all the shades of light blue into medium blue into dark blue. Where HWB goes straight to pink, goes through hot pink, through purple, and then ends up at blue. OKLCH goes straight to yellow, like lime yellow, goes through like lemon, lime yellows into bright green, into like icy green blue, into blue. And none of those are right or wrong. It's just that the mathematical model is so drastically different for each of them that they literally, like if you created a 3-dimensional, you can actually model these color models in 3-dimensional space, and then you can see the straight line between the white and the blue, and you can see why some of them go through this set of colors and other ones go through a totally different set of colors.
Wild.
And yeah, if you want to get into the math, you can, but if you don't want to, just know that like you pick something new, pick one of the new things for defining colors, and then when you go to do a color mix, same thing is true for color mix, or you go to do a gradient, or you go to do relative color syntax, which is also cool. We can talk about that. But you've got a lot of options, and they're all going to result in something different. And maybe the best thing to do is to get yourself into a browser and go into the developer tools and just mess around until you get something that you really like.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about other color APIs. So we have like some really awesome color APIs that have hit the browser lately with relative color. But I was wondering about contrast color. Is that something that is ever going to hit? I don't know if you can speak on that or not, but that's one that I'm anticipating greatly.
Right. Color contrast color. Like it'd be a really great function to be able to say, hey, I told you the background color. Now, could you just make the text be black or white? You choose whichever one is going to have more contrast against this background color that I've chosen. And then I don't have to think about it. I'll let the browser choose. It's implemented in Safari. It's been there forever, much like these other things I mentioned. But we can't ship it yet because there's still discussion happening in the standards organizations. And the hang up is that the algorithm for making a decision on when to pick which colors based on contrast is not doing its job very well. Like, it's choosing the wrong color. And you end up with like black over a dark color or white over a light color.
So you're not able to mathematically calculate if something should be flipped or other. Is it something where the standard has to be set as to like the different ranges? Because even like the YouTube red with white text on top, that is apparently inaccessible.
Yeah. So there was this first attempt to create an algorithm that would make a decision on which color is appropriate. It's just not doing a good job. So it's like, well, so we could ship that. And then we had a long debate. Like, should we just ship it anyway? And the decision was no. So maybe that's why you heard about it and you felt like you almost got it, but then you didn't get it, because that's kind of what happened. The decision was made like, no, we need to wait until there's a good algorithm. So there are new algorithms being worked on. I think it might be true that there's more than one being worked on. Maybe you'll end up with a mechanism where you get to choose which one you want to use. I'm not really sure all the details, but there's definitely work happening in accessibility working groups to like come up with the right mathematical model. But that's why it hasn't shipped yet, is because it doesn't have the right guts underneath in order for it to do the right job. So I do expect it to come, but it will come when it's ready instead of before.
Cool. Yeah, love it.
Let's talk about CSS Grid and Masonry. So probably 6-7 years ago, whenever CSS Grid came out, you and Rachel Andrew were heavily involved in that. And Rachel Andrew just put this GitHub repo up and was just like, ask me anything about Grid. Because like every single question was going to her. And one of the first questions I had was like, can you do the Pinterest layout with CSS Grid where they sort of block into each other? And the answer at the time was not really, unless you have a specific height on a grid. And even then, it's kind of a bit of a hack. So there's been this proposal for CSS Grid Masonry for a long time. And I feel like we're almost there. But you said there's maybe a little bit more to that.
Yeah, so we implemented Masonry in Safari Technology Preview. It's quite mature. I'd love for people to try it out. It's not even behind a flag. You can just open up Safari Technology Preview and try it. I'm working on a blog post for webkit.org to go into more detail and have some examples and get into some of the questions that are happening. And really, because we need feedback from web designers and developers on what you want. Because there's a little bit of we're a little stuck in the CSS working group. Stuck probably isn't the right word, but there's still ongoing debate in the working group about the fundamental approach. So right now, Masonry is part of Grid, where you say display grid and then grid template columns, and you can define what you want for columns. So you can use FR units, you can use min-max, you can use max unit, max content, min content. You can give all of the power of Grid in your column direction. Now, of course, I'm just going to assume we're talking about a horizontal writing mode right now. You could flip it, in which case all the times I say horizontal or columns should be rows and rows would be columns and all that, right? But let's just, for the sake of being on a podcast and having to say everything with our words, let's just assume a horizontal writing mode. So columns, you can make as many columns as you want, and you can make them in Grid be like, they don't have to all be the same size as each other, right? And they don't even all have to be defined by an external definition of like, I want you to be 1/4 of the width. Instead, it can be like, I want you to be the size that your image is inside of you or something. The columns can be sized based on the content. I think people don't know that enough about Grid, but where the Masonry layout, like that sort of classic layout that you were describing, there's always the columns are always the same width as each other. Mm-hmm. Like there's 4 columns, there's 6 columns, there's 12 columns. And they're all like, if the first one is 200 pixels and the next one's 200 pixels and the next one's 200 pixels and the next one's 200 pixels, they're all exactly the same as each other, right? Where with Grid, in the column direction, you have all of that. You have so much more power and so much more flexibility. And then what you would do is say grid template rows, but instead of defining rows, which is what you normally do with grid, where you'd say, I want my rows to all be 400 pixels, or I want my rows to be auto, in which case it's like be however big you need to be able to fit the column, the content that you have. Instead of that, you just say grid template rows masonry. And what that would do is it would stop the rows from being rows, like even with each other. It would stop trying to line up content. Because right now with grid, if you have, let's say, a whole bunch of images and they're all different sizes and different aspect ratios of each other, and maybe you use a width of 100% to make them all be the same width, but their heights are all different. Right now in grid, like grid forces you third row down, all the things in the third row are going to be this, like the tops of them are all going to line up unless you change alignment. But then, okay, the bottoms of all of them all line up. But then there's extra space around them, right? There's no packing. It's just there's a row, and then we start a new row with the fourth row, and then we start a new row with the fifth row. Where masonry lets you be like, actually, I want the browser to pack things.
Yeah.
Just place things so each next item is as close to the top of the page as possible, which lets you lazy load more content into the bottom, and makes you not enforce a row grid. Which makes me think of the history of graphic design and the grid systems in the first place, never mind the web, just like in history, in books and manuscripts. For most of the time, actually, grids meant columns line up. It was really the modernists that came along and said, oh, actually, rows should also line up. You have to line things up in both directions. So it's interesting that as the web added grid and finally added a layout system, the first impulse was to add a layout system that lines everything up in 2 dimensions. Very modernist, very powerful, very exciting, means you can have white space. Like, please, awesome, use white space. But there are use cases where like maybe you don't want that. And in fact, as you said, Wes, that was one of the most frequently asked questions when we wrote grid was like, well, I don't want to line things up in both dimensions. But there are people in the working group who believe that it shouldn't be grid template rows. It shouldn't be display grid template rows masonry. It should instead be display masonry. And you should have a separate display type. That grid is grid, and grid means line up in 2 dimensions.
Yeah.
Flexbox is another one. That's a different thing. We've got multi-column. Then you should have display masonry, in which case you wouldn't have any power in the column direction. You would only have the very simple way to set up columns. Oh, unless we decide to make it more complicated. But then basically we're replicating grid outside of grid. So that's sort of the debate is like, and then there are some people who came along and said, well, do we even need this at all? Like, is anybody even going to use this? Maybe we shouldn't do this at all. So
everyone's making bentos right now. That's the big popular layout is the Apple. I think Apple came up with the bento, right? All the different features of the MacBook Pro were on there, and everyone's like, that's the new design trend. So maybe make it display bento.
Well, and as we've been working on this, we've been looking at other sorts of things besides that kind of classic Pinterest type layout. Mm-hmm. The footer, like mega footer, where you've just got a bunch of different sets of links that you could lay that out using masonry, because there's not really a good way to lay that out today without having to wrap each column in its own div and sort of permanently assign certain things to certain columns.
Yeah.
What if instead you just have a whole bunch of content and you could use masonry to, there's all kinds of, There's also other sorts of, where all the images actually do have the same aspect ratio. They're all, say, 16:9, but you want to stagger them. And maybe you want to stagger them in the opposite direction, where you do want to stagger them across the columns, where your rows are cool, your rows are set, everything's lined up across the rows, but you want to like make a brick wall, like literally a brick wall. You want 3 and then 2 and then 3 and then 2, and you want them to be stacked like masonry. There's not an easy way. You'd have to use negative margins and all sorts of other kind of hacky things to do that today.
I don't mind the idea of being display masonry. It makes sense to me that it's not necessarily a grid. I hadn't really thought about it too much before, but yeah, interesting.
Do you think we'll ever have the ability to target items in a specific grid row or column? Is that something that was ever talked about?
Yeah, we've talked about that a lot for like the next level of grid, which would be like grid 4. We've just, the people who keep having this conversation over snacks at the CSS working group or something, we all end up working on something else, higher priority. But yeah, I'd love to be able to say, hey, everything in the first column should have this font. And then if the content gets rearranged, it's still just whatever's in the first column that has that font. I'd love to be able to put a background on an empty grid cell or a border on grid cells or grid tracks.
Yeah. I wrote a resize observer for westboss.com nav. So when items wrap to the second line, I style them a bit smaller, and I hit a render loop where it was too small, so it went on the first line, and then it got bigger, so it went on to the second line. And I was like, this is what the browser people have to deal with, which is this like infinite.
Can you imagine container queries?
Yeah, sizing things based on their contents, but then the contents can size themselves based on the container, and I do not envy. People have to implement that or spec it out.
Well, and some of these ideas about grid, they seem really cool and really obvious in a way from a graphic design perspective, but from a CSS like CSS programming language perspective, it's like, wait a minute, you'd have styles that style styles instead of content. Instead of pointing these styles to content, you're pointing these styles to other styles. Like, you built this out of grid, it's an empty construct, and you're going to style it? Like, so what does that mean? That's a pretty big, that's like more than grid. That's like a big change to the language. So yeah, we'll get to it, I think.
Yeah.
But
when we had talked, you had mentioned a CSS switch control. Can you talk a little bit about that exists now?
Yeah, so switch controls are, if you use iOS, macOS, and you go into settings, you'll see all these little on-off things that instead of being checkboxes now, often it's a switch. It's like a little slider with sometimes they're green when they're on and gray when they're off, a little round circle that you slide back and forth. And people have used the checkbox as the closest form element that you can use on the web that does that, but it takes a lot of hackiness to like take a checkbox and visually make it look like a switch control. So we've gotten a lot of requests. Hey, I really need to build this switch control, especially since, WebKit's not just used by Safari. It's also used by apps that Apple makes, like Mail and Books. It's also used by like 1 million apps in the App Store. There are so many apps that use WebKit. So we keep getting this request of like, hey, I need to be able to create a switch control. I'm using web content here.
Oh yeah, you want to make it look native.
Yeah, that's what happened. So you write input, and this works now in Safari Technology Preview. Input type equals checkbox to be a nice fallback for HTML because it needs to be elegant through the transition. And then you just add the attribute switch. So if you just add the attribute switch, it immediately turns the checkbox into a switch control, which on our platforms is default styled to look like the operating system.
Yeah.
And then there are 2 pseudo elements that you can use to style the switch to be able to very easily turn it into whatever you want, where you can change how that little circle handle looks. You can change how the track that it slides on looks.
That's cool. I tried it out myself. It's not obviously fully implemented yet. That's why it's in the beta, but I thought it was a really neat way because it's not going to change how forms work at all. It's not a new form input. It simply just changes the actual UI of it and then exposes some new CSS to style it and change the colors. So big fan of that.
Yeah,
totally. Do we want to talk a little bit about the Vision Pro is coming out very soon here, and we don't have to talk too much about the Vision Pro, but perhaps maybe a little bit about the web stuff. Let's say you wanted to see like your website on the Vision Pro. Is there ways that developers can?
I did it.
See?
Did you? Yeah.
Immediately after our call, I downloaded the new Xcode and I opened up Stack Overflow and VSCode.dev, and I was like, I can code in VR. It's wild.
Yeah. So Vision Pro coming out very soon. Maybe even by the time people hear this, it will be out. Safari is on Vision Pro. It is really Safari, which is pretty exciting. It's like all of WebKit, all of the web technology that you know and love from the web is there. A full real browser. And it is, there's, you can easily, if you end up owning a piece of hardware, if you go get yourself an Apple Vision Pro, you can use a Mac and use Web Inspector and inspect the content that you're using through Web Inspector. You can also use a simulator where you can download Xcode. And as in the process of downloading Xcode, it will ask you, like, what do you want to build for? And you can say yes to iOS. You can say yes to Vision OS. You can say yes to watchOS if you want, tvOS. Or you can say no to watchOS and tvOS if you just want to focus on web browsers. And when it downloads, it will download the simulators for Vision OS, and it will download quite a few simulators for iPad and iPhone as well. And it's really cool. One of the things that we did last year that hasn't gotten as much attention as I think it should is we really overhauled the way that Web Inspector and Safari hook up to actual physical devices if you have an iPhone, for instance, and also the way that they hook up to the simulators. So responsive web design mode is cool, and you can use it for a really fast way to kind of check a layout. But if you really want to check what's going on with that layout, you're actually much better off using an iOS simulator. Yeah. It's free, download Xcode, right? Like just get it running on your machine. And if you want to free up some hard drive space, you can actually remove Xcode after you're done if you want. Just keep the simulator around. Oh, really? The simulator app. Yeah, you just need the simulator app with Vision Pro if you want it with iPhones, iPads. But like if you want to test something on an iPhone SE, for example, and you don't have an iPhone SE, well, you can grab the simulator and test it on the simulator. Because the way typography is sized, the exact way that pixels are rendered, like just the precise details of how something gets laid out is actually very different on an iPhone than it is in responsive web design mode on a Mac when you like move the window to be a certain number of pixels wide. And I feel like it's funny. I didn't really realize this until after I joined Apple, but all of those years when so many of us were fretting over, 320, 360, 480, does it look good? I have to make sure. And yet none of us quite realized that we should have been using a simulator if we wanted to be that careful. And so now if you go into responsive web design mode, there's a little drop-down menu that lets you just jump straight into the simulator, or you can, you have to turn on developer tools in Safari, by the way. You go into Safari settings and you just say yes to developer tools. That way regular everyday people don't get freaked out when they accidentally open a web inspector. But when you do that, a new menu appears called the develop menu. And there's a lot of good stuff in that develop menu. And in the develop menu, there's just a shortcut where you can jump straight over to any iPhone or iPad that you have paired to your. So the very first time, if you want to use your own iPhone, for example, you need to use a cable, hook it up to your Mac so that for security reasons, like they're paired together and that we know it's you and that's your phone. But then from then on, you don't ever have to get a cable out again. And it's really solid. Like we worked hard to make sure that it works really well. And you'll just see your iPhone and you can just be like, please open this web page in my iPhone. And boom, you got a web inspector and you can use that web inspector with your iPhone. Yeah.
Man, that's so much better.
Here's a little tip for people listening is it's hard to run old versions of Safari. So one thing I wish that you guys would do is also just give me a simulator for an old version of Safari as well, because we had a bug on the syntax site that was only popping up on an older version of Safari, and I couldn't figure out how to get an old version of desktop Safari running. But it's mostly the same as like iOS Safari, right? So what I did is I just downloaded an older simulator via that, ran it, and then I was able to reproduce the bug and fix it via that. So if you are ever in that problem, maybe just download a simulator.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, so I should state that this episode is coming out on February 2nd, so the day that the Vision Pro is coming out. So if you manage to
so it came out today.
Yes, congratulations to everybody who was able to get one.
And there's several sessions at WWDC about Vision Pro last year where you can see what it really looks like. And there's a lot of details about how it's working. We're still working on WebXR and Model. They're both behind a flag right now. Working out details in some of the standards, getting updated or getting finished to have real full support consensus in the working groups about how exactly all those things are going to work.
One thing we asked Eric Meyer on when we came on was like, what parts of the world are running on web tech that you might not expect. And he had some really cool, interesting, like the PlayStation and some fridges are running on it. And most people don't realize is most TVs are running web tech for your streaming apps. Is there any part of the Apple ecosystem that you might not expect that is actually just running HTML, CSS, JavaScript?
Yeah, well, I mentioned before that there are, of all of the apps in the App Store, all the different things that people think of when they think of an app for iPhone, for iPad, for Mac. Of course, many of those you're inside, maybe a social media app, and you click a link, and there's a browser sort of appears from the bottom. That's called Safari View Controller, which is like a little mini Safari that can live inside of any other app. But there's also another thing called WK Web View, where sometimes an app will actually build their own browser inside the app. That's often built on WK Web View. Or also an app can create really anything if they feel like it and they want to use HTML and CSS and JavaScript for some reason. So somebody really could build quite a lot of their app out of web technology, and there really wouldn't be any way to tell. There wouldn't necessarily be navigation to like forward and back and type in a URL or any of those things we're used to, because at that point it really is up to that app developer to do whatever it is that they want to do with that. So there's this sort of blurry continuum of, well, that's clearly a browser inside an app, to like, well, that looks an awful lot like a browser, but that seems to be branded uniquely, to like, that reminds me of a browser, but it doesn't really look one, to like, this doesn't look at all like a browser. I had no idea. And a lot of those embedded devices love to use WebKit because WebKit is optimized for speed and for saving electricity. It's been the fastest browser engine for a very long time, and it's been, it really is all about, like, I mean, often we're working very hard to optimize things over here to be like, let's use less electricity. Let's use less electricity than that. Like, how can we make it go faster and also use less electricity? So, some of those very low powered devices, they don't have very strong chips on them. They don't have, maybe they have a battery, maybe they don't. Maybe they are just a very low powered chip, and they want something that goes really fast and is very streamlined. And WebKit seems to be one of the favorites to really do that because of the way it's been designed for so many years to work on iPhone and Mac.
I've definitely found that Safari is easily the browser that gets me the most juice especially when I'm needing it. It's always the least resource intensive. I find myself like constantly being a Safari truther now in TikTok comments or things like that. Or, no, you don't understand. It's not Safari of 8 years ago or whatever people compare it to.
In fact, there's a tool in Web Inspector that you can go and see how much electricity your website takes up.
Oh,
really?
Nice.
Yeah, there's many ways to define performance, right? Many important ways on how to define performance. Like how soon is it the person can use the website, right? How long do they have to wait for it to download? But another one is like, how much impact is your site having on battery life? Is there something that's running that you could change, that's sort of burning through somebody's battery, that you could look at and make better so that your site doesn't burn up somebody's battery? It's cool. It's like this meter that shows you how you're doing.
Wow, nice.
That's cool. I never knew that. I'm going to check that out.
We're hitting our time here, so unfortunately we can't hit everything that we really wanted to get to, but that's how it goes, right? I think it's been awesome to have you on, Jen, and I think if you're down for it, we would love to extend this conversation again some other time. Perhaps maybe Safari's dropping some interesting stuff. We'd love you to come on anytime you'd like. So we can definitely pick this up later. Now is the part of the show where we get into things that we call sick picks and shameless plugs, where you can pick something that you've been really enjoying in life. Anything, could be anything. I think we've picked gochujang sauce or all sorts of stuff on here. So whatever you like.
Oh, honestly, what I really like these days is the ability to stand up and walk around.
Nice.
I mean, people may be like, where has Jen been? Why hasn't she been on your show? It's because COVID. Don't get COVID.
Oh my God.
It's like literally I couldn't really stand up and walk around for 2 or 3 years.
Holy cow.
Oh, man.
I mean, I could stand, but I couldn't travel very far. For a long time, it was like 10 feet. And then it was like, okay, I can get out the front door of my building. And then it was like, I could walk about 100 feet and I'd have to rest. I'd have to sit down and rest. And then, yeah, it's bad.
Oh my
Long
gosh.
COVID is no joke.
Well, you are not the first guest to sick pick walking, believe it or not. We had, what's his name from Mojo, Chris Latner, who also creator of Swift. He also enjoys walking. So if you want to work at Apple, go for a walk.
Oh, I used to love hiking with my dog. Yeah, it's great. It's great.
Oh, yeah.
I found the energy impact. Syntax.fm, 24% average CPU usage, duration short. And my own website, 20%. So my own website, much better. And not much better. Both of them are pretty good. But it's cool. You just click on timelines, click on CPU, refresh the page, and it gives you data as to energy usage. Love that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a page about it on webkit.org on how that tool works. There's also there's documentation on all of Web Inspector on webkit.org. Yeah. Oh, is that next on the shameless plugs? Am I getting here?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, whatever you want to plug.
Let's hear them. Let's plug away, please.
Plug anything you want.
Yeah, I mean, webkit.org, I think, is what I'm plugging. There's a lot there. It's not a very complicated site. You're not going to, get lost. But there's a lot of juicy stuff that I think folks haven't really noticed. All sorts of details about how Safari works, how WebKit works, how Web Inspector works, what's coming out next.
And like these are very accessible to web developers.
Yeah.
This is not people who care about browser engines, but like if you care about, how does CSS nesting work? How do I use it? What's the has selector? There's some fantastic blog posts on here, so we'll link that up in the show notes.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we had a whole series on color, in fact, over the years, and there's some really interesting details sometimes about privacy or security, written for a web developer audience, not a security expert audience necessarily, although that audience too. But you don't have to be a security expert to understand it. But sometimes it's very interesting to me to read a little bit about what it is that browser engineers are thinking about as we make the decisions that we're making.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate all of your time. That was super informative. And again, we hope to have you back sometime if you ever want to come on and chat about.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, anytime.
All right. Peace.